Atlas Pandemica, Maps to a Kinder World, is a project by the Stove Network designed to encourage pioneering approaches in charting the changes that have happened since the outbreak of COVID-19 locally, and tries to navigate the way forward into a more hopeful and shared future. In this series, Stove orchestrator Matt Baker speaks with the artists, writers and researchers involved in the project, offering an insight into the process and discoveries each have made. We hope you enjoy.
Welcome to Atlas Pandemica podcast number 1. I'm Matt Baker, and along with artist Robbie Coleman, I'm one of the curators of the project. Atlas Pandemica, Maps to a Kinder World, is a compendium of 10 projects led by creative people, each investigating a different theme highlighted by life during the COVID pandemic. Projects work directly with people in Dumfries and Galloway, focusing on the impacts and the learning from the community's experience of the evolving pandemic. Atlas Pandemica was conceived and is managed by the community-led arts organisation, the Stove Network, and it explores local responses to the pandemic and how these might shape new approaches to our shared future. The project is supported by the Scottish Government's Supporting Communities Fund. You can find more info at www.atlaspandemica.org. So in this series, I'm going to be talking to each of the artists leading one of the Atlas explorations. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Annie Wild. Annie is a freelance social researcher. In the past, she's worked in academia and in a large research agency, but these days she works on research projects with community and arts organisations from across Dumfries and Galloway. She's also involved in local environmental activism. Welcome, Annie. How are you doing?
Yeah, very well, thanks.
Good to have you here. So let's start with the beginning. So could you tell me a bit about what attracted you to the project? What was happening for you during the pandemic when the invitation was to be involved was advertised?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I was initially just attracted to the overall idea of Atlas Pandemica. I thought it seemed fascinating and really worthwhile. And I homed in on this theme of care. There was various sort of themes that people could choose from. I think really because it was so relevant to my life at that point. I mean, I'm a mother of a small toddler and rely on a lot of informal childcare for me to be able to work. And that obviously disappeared. Playgroup closed down, everything just shut down. And over that sort of early lockdown period. And also my partner became ill with, it was a sort of mysterious illness that we kept saying, is it COVID, isn't it COVID? But we sort of realized now it probably was. So yeah, it was very, very pertinent issue for me at that point. And I've actually always had this interest in, in feminism and sort of sociology of feminism, and sort of different values that are placed on different kinds of work, particularly unpaid work, which is sort of largely done by women and is very kind of marginalized, and there's sort of issues around that.
Okay, so you called your project For Love Not Money, and you've mentioned that idea of care in the in your first answer there, and I think let's unpack that concept of care a little bit more. Like what exactly was it you were drawn to, and what were you setting out to do originally?
Okay, yeah, it did change quite a bit throughout the project. Initially, I started off with this really broad interest in care, and I was wanting to. In the very early days, I was thinking of speaking to paid and unpaid carers and possibly parents and basically everybody who does anything vaguely caring. And then I realized this was completely ridiculous to try and do in the space of 6 months or a bit longer. So I really kind of homed in on wanting to speak to unpaid carers, particularly people that work with an adult family member or a friend, and care in that sort of capacity. I guess partly because I felt like that was a group that hadn't really been paid much attention to throughout the pandemic. I feel like there's been loads of newspaper coverage of parents and all the kind of trials and tribulations we've been through, but very little towards unpaid carers. And so that, just in terms of it being a sort of a group of people to work with, seemed really worthwhile. But there's the more kind of conceptual stuff as well. And care has been written on a lot recently. There's kind of some quite interesting political activism around it, and bits of writing like the Care Manifesto, which is written by a group of academics who've really sort of put forward this polemic about rebuilding society based on more kind of caring values and how we do that structurally. And the politics is all there as well. It's very easy with care, I think, to kind of to initially think, oh, this all sounds a bit sort of sentimental and kind of nicey, and oh, we should all care for each other. But actually, an awful lot of people are writing about really sort of weighty political aspects of how society is structured and how decisions are made, and right at the top levels, and the lack of care that's been shown particularly by the Westminster government throughout the pandemic, and completely sidelining people with long COVID and not locking down early enough, and all these things that many of us have complained about. So yeah, it goes right from I think care goes right from the very sort of personal day-to-day aspects of people's lives right through to major political issues, which has been really interesting, but it also has made it quite a hard project to pin down and make doable.
Yeah, and we're talking about a phenomenal amount of people, wasn't it? I mean, what was the percentage that you had of people who are actually carers in our society?
Before the pandemic, is about 16% in Scotland. It's actually gone up. I couldn't tell you offhand what it was gone up by, but it has gone up substantially because so many people have been really haven't had any choice. They've kind of found themselves in a caring role because so many of the formal paid services closed their doors during the first lockdown. And actually a lot of them didn't really open up again, or not open up fully, even through the summer when things were, everyone sort of felt, in Scotland at least, or particularly in Dumfries and Galloway, that things eased off a bit in summer and things were opening, but an awful lot of formal care services didn't really open up again fully. And obviously that then puts huge amounts of pressure on existing unpaid carers, and means that people who haven't thought of themselves as carers before suddenly are. And it's a very sort of grey area as well, like who counts as a carer, because to get the carers allowance, you need to be doing at least 35 hours of care a week. So it really needs to be your full-time job. But if someone's doing 15 or 20 or 25 hours a week care, that's still pretty full on. And I think a lot of people would still think of that as being a carer, but you're not then getting the government support to actually do that role. So there's a lot of sort of grey areas as to what counts as a carer and who doesn't as well. It's an awful lot of us, no matter which way you look at it.
And how did you select the people that you work with, and and how did that working process unfold? I've heard you talk about co-production. Could you say a little bit about that and that working process? Sure. Yeah.
Okay. In terms of just the sort of practical aspect of finding people, I really just used Facebook and set up a page that was just for the project, and phoned up carers organisations as well, particularly the Dumfries Carers Centre, who are extremely helpful and very supportive of the project in the early stages. And really sort of just recruited online, which is a bit frustrating because I sort of prefer to really connect with people face to face. And if it hadn't been during COVID, then I would have just turned up at the actual carer centre in Dumfries and chatted to people face to face, but obviously that wasn't an option. Sort of connected to people that way, and did initial interviews that were very sort of very open-ended, informal, not particularly directed at a specific outcome. And I was very open about that from the start, about the fact that people could influence the agenda of the project. And And yeah, this term co-production that you've mentioned is something that I've done in other projects as well, and that an awful lot of artists, researchers, people in the public sector as well, increasingly are kind of using co-production. And but everybody sort of uses the term in a slightly different way. It can mean lots of different things. But to me, my sort of ideal in terms of doing co-produced work is that I try and make sure there's opportunities for people to influence the research agenda. So, you know, you don't really want to be offloading huge amounts of work, and you certainly don't want to be saying to people, oh, I've got this admin and transcribing to do. Do you want to help me out with it? Because they're going to run a mile. And that's really not your sort of research participant's job. But there should be sort of open dialogue and discussions where you say, look, this is sort of where I'm coming from. These are the themes I'm interested in. And maybe make a few suggestions for things that you think would work in terms of an output, and really hear people out in terms of whether they think it's worthwhile, whether they have other ideas. And yeah, just giving people a chance to kind of input where the project goes. Like, to me, that's when I hear the term co-production, or when I'm claiming to work in a co-produced way, that's what I'm thinking of.
Interesting. And so that's what you feel happens. The people that you were working with actually ended up directing the project along with you. Yeah?
I wouldn't say directing it. I'd say I don't want to overstate it, because it's in terms of the output, it's still my idea to I'm sure we'll get onto it in a moment, to do these sort of networks of care. I think very much in terms of social networks. But just to have that kind of open dialogue, and to first give people the opportunity to say if they think it's complete rubbish. And also, I guess the way in which we did it was people did have a lot of input, and that varied as well. You know, some people they've got different interests, and some people might be interested in the kind of visual design aspect of it. Some people aren't really, and are just like, nah, you just do that. We'll do our interviews, and that's fine. And you know, you need to sort of offer that level of flexibility so that you're not kind of pushing people into being involved in a way that they're not really into. But yeah, I do feel like people did have the opportunity to sort of input into the way it went. And I tried to as well, in terms of after that first wave of interviews, I tried to be reflective myself in terms of like thinking, well, what am I getting from these interviews? What are the themes that are coming through? And using that as the basis for what the next step is, rather than, because I was also doing loads of reading at the time. And, you know, as I've sort of already mentioned, all this sort of broader conceptual reading about care. But I tried more to be directed by what was coming through with the interviews than all this other stuff that maybe didn't even always connect that much to people's actual lives.
Such an interesting and important kind of concept, I think, when we're thinking about this sort of work, because we're used as a society to the idea of people wanting to know what the end product is going to be, what the output is going to be before you start, and you've always got it sort of supposed to have it tied down, and we know where it's going because we've done certain things before, and we are in this uncharted territory of how are we going to face this new reality that we're all living with. And I think that kind of, I would define that as a sort of creative process of that sort of inquiry which is done collaboratively without exactly knowing where it's going to start with, but you start with, I think it's an important it's an important model for the way that we need to work as a society. I mean, you mentioned the idea there of you brought up the networks of care. I mean, I'd really like you to be able to talk about those. So can you tell us about them, and what they tell us about unpaid care and the impact of the pandemic, and ultimately how we live together as a society?
Okay. Big questions.
Small question, right?
Yeah. Okay, so one of the main outputs from this project is these large diagrams, which I've kind of done my bit of it and worked with very closely with 2 carers to produce. And now our wonderful designer Alan is turning them into something a lot more beautiful than I would have been able to come up with. But basically, these are they're kind of, you can imagine like a large mind map with a person in the middle who's the carer, and the person they care for as 2 kind of nodes within that mind map. And then coming from them, all the different people and organizations and anything at all, basically, any being or institution or anything that the carer feels they have a caring relationship with can go on the network of care. And then there's lines or joining them up and joining up the other relationships between them. So all family members, neighbors, pets.
Yeah, I loved all that. There was the dogs, news
Yeah.
agent,
Oh God.
Yeah.
That's so important to them.
People you meet on a dog walk. Yeah.
Anything at all. So, and that was, and again, I guess that's the sort of co-produced thing as well, is that I was constantly encouraging the carers that I worked with to think of their definition of a caring relationship. Like, it really doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. It's supposed to be mapping their network. So if it's a caring relationship, let's put it on. And then also you get some organizations that it was a bit of a difficult one, because it was a relationship that sort of should be caring and is offering some sort of care, but not very well. So, and particularly during early lockdown, people were let down by formal services, and that sort of story was told as well. So yeah, and I should add as well that although it's this big diagram, and then within each sort of node, within each person or organization, there's lots of text, which I've edited and painstakingly put together based on a series of several interviews in each case, with each carer, to really sort of, it's kind of a storytelling method as well, which goes into a lot of detail about people's lives. And ultimately, so I interviewed quite a few people, but with these networks of care, it's ended up just being 2 people, 2 carers that I've worked with really closely to produce these kind of mind map networks of care.
And it's fascinating, I think, how you kind of wonder how different those networks would have looked like if it wasn't the pandemic.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, the text kind of does explain that to some degree. You kind of get some sense of, people are sort of explaining like, oh, this relationship was strengthened and this thing disappeared. And I mean, in one of the carers, her mother dies. So, the networks are always changing and people come and go for different reasons. And I'm not sure if that sort of sense of change and of it being a very dynamic thing comes across when you immediately look at it. But if you start delving down and reading into the stories, you realize that actually this is just constantly evolving.
Yeah, I was just, the news agent who, one of the people being cared for had dementia and was had no concept of what social distancing was, or it didn't seem to appear, it didn't affect him because he wasn't ill. And how the newsagent coped with that, I thought, there were those really lovely little details about how our society is actually held together by those kind relationships, or those understanding relationships. Yeah. And we rely on it as a society.
Sorry?
And we rely on it as a society.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah,
there's an awful lot of details that are really touching in terms of, I think those more peripheral kind of relationships that do actually make quite a big difference to people's quality of life.
And were there extra challenges that fell upon unpaid carers during the pandemic? Was that something that came through strongly? Yeah,
for sure. Both in terms of those 2 carers that I worked with really closely, and then the other interviews that I did that didn't get sort of as developed as far. I mean, one of the huge things, and I've already mentioned it really, but I can't really get away from it, is that thing of the formal services just disappearing, and so many more people suddenly having huge amounts more caring responsibilities, and then the financial impact of that, because if you're doing huge amounts more care, you can't do your paid job, or it becomes impossible to apply for jobs. So, and that's kind of always been an issue for unpaid carers, is this issue, that they've got a much higher rate of being in poverty, because of the inability to work a lot of the time. But that all sort of just ramped up during COVID. And I don't think it's really resolved. I think a lot of people are still struggling. And then, things like social isolation. I mean, that's been a problem for many of us most of us even, over this past year. But for a lot of carers, that can sort of be exacerbated because they're having to spend so much time caring for one other person, and can feel quite sort of cut off from other aspects of society. So I think it has been, my impression is that it has been a really challenging time for an awful lot of carers.
In the writing that you've done around the project, you sort of identified you identify unpaid care as being considered a social issue rather than an economic issue. Mm-hmm. Why is that distinction so important to you?
Yeah, so this is the kind of other side of the project, from the very co-produced, working very closely with people aspect of it, is that I also did loads of reading into issues around care generally, sort of concepts of care, and also quite dry stuff around the policy that's been produced apparently to support unpaid carers through the pandemic. And as in a lot of cases has sort of let people down through being produced too late or being too ambiguous, and there's not really been a particularly strong focus from government on unpaid carers, I'd say, and certainly the unpaid carers I spoke to felt that way as well. And one of the things, as you say, I really bring out in the essay that I've written on this, is that unpaid care generally gets sort of, without anyone really ever saying this out loud, gets categorized as being a social issue and not an economic one. And I guess to a lot of people that might seem obvious that it would be, because you think, well, it's unpaid care, that's not really part of the economy. But to an awful lot of feminist economists, it should be. And this is something that people have been arguing for a long time now. There's a woman called Marilyn Wearing, who wrote a really important book in the 80s called what's it called again? Making Women Count, possibly. That was really sort of launched feminist economics, and one of the sort of main drivers behind it is saying, in the sort of earliest days of economics being set up as a discipline, going way back to Adam Smith and all these early theorists, they actually had a broader view of what economics was, and they thought of it in very broad social terms as well. And it's only much later that that we've dropped out an awful lot of what we should be thinking of as the economy, and focus purely on the market economy and only on transactions, and basically defining it as any activity that makes money. You can get into some quite complex issues here, but basically our whole economy is completely dependent on unpaid work, and particularly unpaid care. Just even imagine if carers went on strike, and if all the parents went on strike, and society would completely melt down. And some people have even done like full economic analysis of this, and I get into some of the figures and things in the essay that I've written. Oxfam Scotland have actually done a lot of really good work on this, and shown that unpaid care is worth like twice the amount of the financial services industry.
It's fascinating. I mean, it does. It ultimately leads to. I took that idea of, it's so blindingly obvious mm-hmm. that our society is basically underpinned by all of that unpaid work.
Yeah.
the keeping of houses, the bringing up of children, the caring for people allows the transactional economy to function. Without that frees the space for the transactional economy. And yet we don't look at it.
It gets completely marginalized.
It's an assumption. And I mean, I completely understand the feminist point there, because predominantly that role is played by women in our society. It's a massive issue that we need to address. That your project really points at the heart of. It really does. I mean that's the sort of $64 million question, I guess, really is like, what do you feel you've learned there, and what are the lessons in terms of, we've been talking about build back better. What should we be doing about that now in terms of making it more obvious, or valuing? How do we value that more?
How do we do it? That's the difficult one. I guess it really comes down to an awful lot of it is about broadening our view of what the economy is. And unfortunately, we're in some ways pushing at an open door here, because a lot of these ideas are becoming more mainstream. Scottish government claim, at least, to be embracing the concept of the well-being economy, which is much broader. And they've got this national framework that basically sort of says, like, how's the government doing? And we have these measures of success, and an awful lot of them are social measures, and so that is really positive that we kind of are moving in that direction, but just not enough. The organizations like the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, they're doing really good work on this, and they're sort of pushing for the government to really, as I say, broaden that out further, and to include things like unpaid care, things like environmental effects of the economy, and to really sort of try and push for the economy to be based less on just growth and competition, and which ultimately ends up with erosion of workers' rights, and people, the economy basically being more hostile to humans, and more difficult for us to fit in our social lives, more difficult for us to fit in our caring responsibilities.
When you say include it in the economy, what does that actually mean in terms? How does that work?
I guess what I'm trying to say is, when people are developing economic policy, I mean, if you look at any sort of economic policy document online, unpaid care isn't mentioned. It's very straightforward, or it'll be mentioned very briefly in very sort of, so we need to fulfill the rights of unpaid carers and appreciate them or whatever. But it's not really built into economists' idea of what their job is. So that's kind of what I mean, is that it should be far more of a central concern.
So you mean in terms of measurement, like in terms of the way that we understand economy and therefore make decisions around it, that those issues like unpaid care need to be measured?
I mean, for sure. Like one of the things that Marilyn Waring is always pushing for, and has done for years and years, is for time use surveys to be part of government, just the sort of basic data collection that they do, to get a sense of, like, okay, there's a certain amount of work that's done within this country each year. We don't actually know what it is. If you don't do time use surveys, then you haven't got a clue what people are doing and how much work it takes to actually keep the show on the road. And obviously points out that if you don't have good quality data collection, then how are you supposed to create policies that work? And then, pardon me. And I mean, we have the census, which will be collecting data next year on the number of unpaid carers, but it doesn't really get into that sort of really fine-grained time use data collection that she's talking about. So that's one sort of tangible thing. And yeah, one of the sort of things that could affect is, as I was sort of saying before, when economic policy is developed, and this is something that the Wellbeing Economy Alliance have been sort of raising as well. It's this thing of if there's too much, if the focus is too much on growth and on competition, then you end up with a situation where the economy is totally hostile to people's sort of work-life balance and their other commitments, and it actually makes caring far more difficult. So, you know, if you're on a 0 hours contract and other members of your family are, and you're trying to also balance that with being a carer or being a parent, obviously that's really difficult. So if policymakers aren't sort of considering those things when they're producing these policies, then it's
basically making people
really
unhappy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how much kind of social policy you put on top of that and say, oh, but every carer gets a carer's assessment done, and you can access mental health services and you can access these services. It's like, okay, it's good that Scottish Government are sort of looking at these things as well and making sure that there's services that are designed for carers, but the services can't do anything about an economic situation that's hostile to people, basically. And it's just never really going to solve the problems that people have.
We've kind of got ourselves into this strange situation where the economy is almost this sort of abstract notion that is a sort of self-contained thing about creating wealth.
Yeah.
And we've kind of like lost the idea that the economy is actually about people's well-being, is about like keeping us all healthy and happy and fulfilled in our lives. And that's what an economy is for. It's I mean, just like just sort of take a slightly different tack on this is we talked a little bit about that kind of creative inquiry at the beginning, and I'm particularly interested in your take on that from a because you're not from an artistic background. You wouldn't style yourself as an artist like many of the people in this project. So that that idea of not absolutely knowing where we're trying to get to, but starting with this with a direction of travel, and then committing to the process of inquiry, but in a collaborative way. I'm really interested in how that sort of differed for you from the way that you normally work, and how it might have affected the outcomes or the way that you think about your work going forward. Yeah,
it has been a very, very different process from what I'm used to. Generally, the work that I do, it's very kind of applied social research. So I'll usually be working with an organization that want to find out something quite specific, or maybe a set of outcomes that are quite specific. So right from the beginning, that's your kind of guiding principle of like, how do we answer this question? And you do it in a sort of, clear way as possible. Whereas with this, it was just like this completely amorphous sort of, okay, I'm journeying into this theme of care, and there's people that I'm working with, and I've got the interviews to sort of guide me to some degree, but obviously the interviews end up if people are talking about their lives, they're going off on all sorts of tangents, talking about all sorts of different things. So I did find it pretty challenging, if I'm honest, because it's much easier to sort of have a sense of, am I doing my job properly when you've got a really clear outcome and that you're aiming towards. You kind of, you know what the work is. Whereas with this, it's like, I know there will be some output at the end. I'm pretty confident I'll produce something, but because I don't have any like benchmark to measure it against, it's hard to assess if it's good enough or if it's enough that I've done. But it does make it really exciting as well. And I think ultimately what I've produced, particularly with the networks of care, one of the really lovely things about them is that it's, it's, as I was saying before, it's a kind of storytelling method. And it goes in, they go into an awful lot of detail. They're very personal, actually. People are really opened up. And what I hope is that people will look at them and they'll actually sort of see different aspects of their own lives in it, whether they're carers or not. There's, it covers all sorts of themes in terms of just the things that have been challenging through the pandemic over this last year. I think that's kind of exciting to think that I've produced this thing or co-produced these pieces of work where people can really come to their own conclusions and can learn different things from them. And it's not just, okay, I'm just making this one point and hammering it home and producing evidence to kind of back it up. So yeah, it's a far looser process and far more interesting in a way to enable the viewer to kind of take part in sort of creating the meaning for the piece of work as well. So yeah, those are the sort of big differences.
It's then interesting to think about how, if we're talking about different ways of measuring in order to make the economy policy more responsive, how that idea of open-ended inquiry might be part of that measurement, because that idea of the co-production and people's voices genuinely being heard, that's the holy grail, isn't it, to actually reflect people genuinely in that policy. And so it's one of the things that I'm really interested in as an artist, is how that artistic inquiry can be part of those policy decisions in the future. I think you're an absolutely fascinating example of that kind of hybrid approach. It's important. It's important work, Annie. Just to kind of like finish then, where you got ideas about where this could go next, or what you'd like to do with it, or how somebody else could pick it up, or what
kind of. I do have some ideas, but if I'm perfectly honest, I'm not in the best headspace for developing them, because I am about to have a baby in less than a fortnight. Very, very heavily pregnant, and my focus is very much on that. So I'm going to be doing a lot of unpaid care, that's for sure. That's how I'm going to take it forward. I definitely would like to, and I'm really in, all the stuff on the sort of these sort of radical ideas around economics have been important to me for quite a long time, and I definitely want to develop them further. And I'd love to be able to do another project with unpaid carers, but it's a bit hard for me to say what that would be at this stage, because I'm not thinking further than the next few months, really.
You've got the biggest focus there is. So I totally understand. Hey, Annie, that's been brilliant, just brilliant. Thank you so much. I think that home into that like minute detail of like somebody's relationship with their pet or their neighbor, and then to expand that out into a vision of economics is just, I think it's genius. I think it's wonderful. Thank you for sharing, and to be able to do that in our region, in the circumstances of the pandemic. I think everybody in Atlas Pandemica has just discovered this new focus through, it has the context of the pandemic has made this possible, hasn't it? Has made us able to think differently, and I think you're an incredible example of that. Thank you so much for going through the ordeal of talking about it, and so that's been Atlas Pandemica podcast number 1 with Annie. Thank you, Annie. And there are 10 of these podcasts, so you'll find them all on the Stove Network podcast site, and we look forward to the next one. Thanks so much, Annie. See you later.